Thank you. First, I want to recognize the Coast Salish people on whose territory that we are on today. And I seconded Russ's nomination. I have known Russ for probably about 30 years, I guess, and he's worked for the Wolf Lake First Nation and the Algonquin Nation Secretariat Tribal Council for probably about 25 years. He has provided us advice and assistance on mostly on land issues and consultation issues, and we have never had any issues with his with the advice that he has provided. And he does a lot of the work that he does on a voluntary basis. As everybody knows, he's always on Twitter and Facebook trying to educate people, especially the grassroots people, and also the chiefs. We have learned a great deal from him over the years, and he knows the Quebec issues very well, and also other issues across the country. Right from treaties to the comprehensive claims issue, which is a really important issue for the Algonquin people because we come from a non-treaty area, and basically our territory is the Ottawa River watershed. Parliament Hill sits on Algonquin territory, and Russ has always advised us to not go into the comprehensive claims because in the end you have to surrender your title and jurisdiction until there's a better policy. So he's also advised us the Quebec region on as a technical representative on specific claims, which is now called lands, territories, and resources. I am the Quebec rep, the political rep, and Russ acts as my technical advisor on that. And over the years, we have known Russ to provide information based on what he knows. And if you want to, I guess if you don't want to hear something, then don't ask Russ, because he always provides the advice based on what he knows for sure, and he does his research. He doesn't sugarcoat anything, which is one of the reasons why that we have him as an advisor and for the Tribal Council and also the Wolf Lake First Nation over the years. And I think that he can bring a lot to the Assembly of First Nations at this day and age because he's a no-nonsense guy. And I think he will make an excellent national chief. So, Russ, I won't take up too much time because I want the people to hear your message. So thank you, Russ. And
yeah, Wyke Miigwech, to my mover and seconder. So I was pushed by some strong women to run for the Assembly of First Nations National Chief position. Wasn't something that I aspired to do. I've been around 30 years, around national Indian politics, or as we say nowadays, national Indigenous politics. Many of you chiefs know me. Some of the newer chiefs don't know me. But I have worked for past national chiefs like David Hennekew and Ovid McCurdy. I also worked for the National Indian Brotherhood in 1981 in parliamentary liaison, where I was taught how the parliamentary system works by Mickey Poslins, who basically set up the parliamentary liaison unit under President Noel Starblanket of the National Indian Brotherhood. So I've watched this organization over the years. I've been part of it. I've been involved in drafting resolutions. I've watched the deliberations of this Assembly and the decisions of this Assembly, and we've gone through a lot of issues together. But the trend I've seen, I don't know how many of you remember the Declaration of First Nations from 1980. That was a good declaration. I encourage the chiefs to review that again. And then the 1981 Aboriginal Treaty Rights Principles. Those were good principles. That was before the Constitution Act 1982 was adopted. But we had principles then. And if you look at those principles now, in retrospect, decades later, you'll see this Assembly has, I think, strayed from those principles. And that's been a concern to me. But my bigger concern is our relationship with the Crown governments. I was one of the ones that helped create the Aboriginal Peoples Commission of the Liberal Party of Canada in 1990. I was Vice President of Policy from 1990 to 94. So I had to deal with Jean Chrétien with his majority government when he was elected in 93. We were involved in Chapter 7 of the Red Book on the Aboriginal platform. We helped develop the longer Aboriginal platform. So I was a Liberal insider. I got to see how they operate as a government, as they operate from opposition into government. And I know they basically govern by secrecy and deceit. They rely a lot on public relations and communication strategies to disguise their real intent. And that hasn't changed. I was told by young Liberals, Justin Trudeau is different. He's not like Jean Chrétien. But 2.5 years in, I don't see any difference. I see him continuing what Harper was doing, except he's trying to rebrand it. In 2015, he ran on a platform of very nice-sounding promises. And a lot of our people voted for the first time. I think even the incumbent national chief said he voted. And they promised a nation-to-nation relationship, reconciliation process. They said they'd remove the 2% cap off the funding that Paul Martin put in 1995 when he was finance minister under Prime Minister Chrétien. The murdered and missing women inquiry, he promised to set that up. He promised a law and policy review to decolonize Canada's laws as it relates to Indigenous peoples. So he made big promises. And his government entered into an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, with the Assembly of First Nations on fiscal relations in 2016. 2017, he entered into a Memorandum of Understanding on shared priorities. There was no resolution from this Assembly supporting either of those initiatives. Maybe on the fiscal relations, but I'm pretty sure there isn't one on the shared priorities MOU. And there really wasn't due diligence on that. And if, despite signing those MOUs, last year, the Trudeau government, they passed 10 principles on Indigenous relationships. And those principles are to recolonize us. They're not there to help us. They're based on the doctrine of discovery. They're based on the Constitution Act 1867 to maintain the federal and provincial government's dominance over our affairs. There's no recognition of Indigenous jurisdiction, let alone our land rights. And then the Prime Minister, the other promise he made, he had the gall to say, well, I'm going to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He also said he's going to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 97 calls to action. Early in 2016, Jim Carr told the Standing Committee on Indigenous Affairs, we're going to develop a Canadian definition of the UN Declaration. And right after that, Minister of Indigenous Affairs, as she was then called, Carolyn Bennett, went to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and said, we're going to endorse the United Nations Declaration without qualification. But then she qualified it. She said, within the context of the Canadian Constitution. So right away, we're talking about Section 9124, Indians and lands reserved for Indians, and their interpretation of Section 35. Because ever since the constitutional talks in the 1980s failed, they've come up with unilateral policies. I said I was involved with the Liberal government. One of the promises we got them to do in 1993 was they promised to recognize the inherent right to self-government as an existing right under Section 35. They said the Liberal government would do that. What did they do when they formed a majority government in 1993? In 1995, they defined the inherent right unilaterally through a policy. Now hundreds of bands are negotiating under that policy. That policy has preconditions. Those preconditions that you have to accept to negotiate in that policy is you have to agree to convert your Indian Act band into a municipality. And that's what they've been implementing because they put money into negotiations and it costs money to go to court to get a Section 35 judgment to say no. You know, we have Aboriginal or treaty rights under Section 35. It costs millions and millions of dollars. And that's the other thing in the 10 principles, is the last 30 years of jurisprudence by the Supreme Court laying out legal principles and tests, which cost millions and millions of dollars to collect the historical and cultural information for us to assert we have Aboriginal and treaty rights. Even when we win, we lose. Look at the Chilcotin decision in June 2014. Yes, they were granted Aboriginal title by the Supreme Court of Canada, but the Supreme Court also said in that judgment that the radical or underlying title belongs to the Crown. That's based on the doctrine of discovery. The Supreme Court's in a conflict of interest when it comes to our rights. We were supposed to have a political agreement in the 1980s to interpret our Aboriginal and treaty rights under Section 35. They ran the clock out on us, and then they imposed unilateral federal policies on us, and we fell for it, many of us, not all of us. But many have compromised their Section 35 rights and gone into agreements because they didn't see any other option. Couldn't afford to go to court, so we'll negotiate under these policies. They're funding the negotiations. So over the last 30 years, I've seen our rights being limited and terminated through policy after policy. You know, the 1969 white paper said in order to get rid of reserves, you have to go through various transitional steps, intermediate steps. And what do we see? We see the First Nations Land Management Act. The First Nations Land Management Act is to set up a land registry system to start registering individual interests. That's a transitional or interim step. The government also has on the book still, you know, what Tom Flanagan and Manny Jules are promoting under Stephen Harper, the First Nations Private Ownership Initiative to privatize reserves by turning them into fee simple. That's still in the INAC 2017-18 work plan. You can look it up for yourself. It's there. And they're saying it's optional, but they're still promoting it. They're still maintaining the goals of turning the bands into municipalities and reserves into fee simple or private property. That's their objectives. You know, I've seen documentation in the government. It says basically Indian Act bands are non-governing bodies because you're under the minister and the department. The only way out of that is to get into modern agreements. You either have to sign a self-government agreement, a modern treaty with a self-government component, or a legislative arrangement passed by Parliament. That's why they're calling this Recognition Act enabling legislation, because they're not recognizing you have any inherent rights unless you agree to negotiate it through their policy. That's exactly what they said to us in the constitutional talks in the 1980s, when the debate was, is the self-government an inherent right, or is it a contingent right depending on reaching agreements with Crown governments? Of course, at the constitutional table, all 4 national Aboriginal organizations said no. It's an inherent right. It's already in Section 35. You just have to recognize it. Well, that didn't happen. The government waited and came through it with a policy objective. But now they want to elevate their policies over the past 30 years into legislation. I've been telling chiefs across the country, you have to ask yourself, why are there 2 federal departments being created by Trudeau? He's creating a Department of Indigenous Services Canada. That's for Indian Act bands, whether you're in Aboriginal title territory in BC or elsewhere, or whether you're in treaty territory on the prairies or elsewhere. As long as you're under the Indian Act, you're going in under DISC and Minister Jane Philpott. Basically, their Section 9124 Indian Act on reserve responsibilities are there. But what they want to do is they want to move everybody over to the new Ministry of Crown Indigenous Relations. It used to be called Northern Affairs too, but just last week in the cabinet shuffle they took Northern Affairs away, so they're basically cementing that north of 60 line from the provinces now. There's going to be another minister dealing with north of 60. So you're making all these changes without consulting us. Major, major changes to legislation, policy, and structure of government. And what has the AFN done? They haven't done any critical analysis of any of this. You know, their job is supposed to warn the chiefs of any dangers from Ottawa and what they're doing. But they've basically turned into a cheerleader for the federal government. They've lost control of the process. You know, it's the federal government driving the process through this bilateral mechanism, which is a fancy way of saying a AFN cabinet committee, where you meet with the Prime Minister annually and with ministers on a quarterly basis. But it's all to implement, you know, the agenda of the Trudeau government. So you've got these two departments. You know, Crown Indigenous Relations is for the modern treaties, self-government agreements. And basically, like I said, they want you to sign a self-government agreement and a modern treaty or legislation if you want to become a recognized Indigenous government. And that's why there's two fiscal policies. Under DISC, it's going to be for the Indian Act bands, you're going to be a contribution agreement. Under Crown Indigenous Relations, it's going to be transfer payments. They're revising the transfer payment formula now, but it's going to involve own source revenue and taxation. And I was at a meeting of the Quebec Chiefs where I heard a Quebec Chief on February 15th, right after the Valentine's Day speech. Quebec Chief asked the Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, what about Section 87, you know, the section that says property on reserve is tax exempt? She says, well, that's a tough one, Chief, but with self-government comes taxation. If they're going to, in this legislation, if they're going to start removing sections of the Indian Act and replacing them with this Recognition Act, our people need to know this because this is affecting their livelihoods. It's not just going to be the chief and councils. You know, I've heard a lot about the $17 billion in new money. That seems to enamor a lot of you chiefs. But I'd point out that that $17 billion in new money is a drop in the bucket compared to what we need. And it's within the context of the on-reserve Indian Act dependency programs. That's what it's based on. And by the time you break it down nationally into the regions or provinces and into the bands and through the organizations, it's just pennies on the dollar, really. And, you know, $17 billion might pay for the band offices and band office staff and the chief and councils and the organizations, and everybody might be happy with that because everybody's working and employed and has travel money and expenses and everything. But our people aren't part of that. Their needs aren't being met. I've watched for the last 30 years as the government establishes fiscal policies and programs we internalize, and more, the real gap that needs to be closed is between leadership and membership, especially under the right of self-determination. If we're going to talk the talk of saying we want international standards applied to us, then we have to do that within our own governments and communities too. Chief and councils don't control self-determination. That belongs to the people. Aboriginal treaty rights are collective rights. That belongs to the people. But where's the people's voices in this? You know, during my campaign, people said, you know, we should vote for the national chief. And I kept telling them, AFN's not a government. You know, the way I describe AFN to them is AFN is the bands, you know, the band offices, the band councils, the organizations, and the office in Ottawa. You know, the AFN charter is all based on the Indian Act structure. That's what it's based on. So if you want to change anything and you want to vote, you need to start from the ground up in your communities and in your nations. Not at some office in Ottawa that's basically controlled and funded by the federal government. We need to change that. It's no wonder that we're in the situation we're in now because they're directing and managing us. And that's what they want the legislation to do. They want to control and manage us into a new relationship. You know, it's like the Indian Act's an antiquated jail cell. The toilet's rusting, the bed's rusting, but they're saying, hey, we're going to give you a new jail cell. It's going to have a shiny chrome toilet. You know, we'll even throw in the sink, you know, in a kitchen. But it's still a jail cell. They're offering a municipal model of government. Is that what our people are aspiring to? Nationhood. You know, Budget 2018, the reconciliation chapter, they call it. They're saying reconstituting of nations. They set $100 million aside for us to apply, to make proposals to apply to reconstitute our nations. But yet, really, all they're interested in is larger program delivery units, the smaller bands to amalgamate with other bands so it's cheaper to deliver education, housing, social services. They're just looking at economies of scale. But again, they're appropriating our terms and they're defining it. It's not us. We need to take control of that and develop our own self-determination plans at the community level. Every community needs a GIS system. We need computer mapping. We need to map who the third parties are around us, what the state of our traditional territory is. We need to assert our jurisdiction. We need to change our thinking on getting out of the Indian Act box and off to the reserve box. Trudeau hasn't talked about lands, territories, and resources. He's talked about programs and services. Trudeau hasn't talked about what's he going to do with the premiers in the provinces, because they're the ones that have our stolen lands, territories, and resources. Article 26 says we should be getting restoration of our lands, territories, and resources we held. Article 27 says we should be jointly developing a process to adjudicate our land rights. Jointly. We never had any say in the comprehensive and specific claims since Pierre Elliott Trudeau passed it in 1973 and Justin Trudeau's implemented in 2018. It's the same policies. We get to talk about process, changing the process, like a Made in BC process, or accelerating this process, or an independent process, but we never get to talk about the fundamental terms of the negotiations. That's all dictated to by Ottawa. And that's what we have to change. Article 29 of the UN Declaration says, if we don't get restoration of lands, territories, and resources, then we should get restitution. We should get compensation. You know, if they're not going to give Vancouver back to the Coast Salish nations around here, then they should be talking about some serious compensation, I think. But these are the things that we need to start focusing on. But is the Prime Minister talking about that? No, he's directing us. You know, it's in the 1980s, they called it the buffalo jump of the 1980s. Well, it's really not buffalo because we're more like domesticated cattle at this point. And they're leading us down the chute. They're closing the doors. They're saying, you want economic development? They'll open this door to this chute. They're closing the other ones. And, of course, we all single file follow the leader, right? The cow in front of us. And you know what the destination of that is? You know, it's the abattoir. Well, I call it the termination plan. But that's what it is. They want to terminate our collective rights because they're looking at the younger generation, our young cohort. They want to... and their liabilities. Those are the two things that drive the federal government, is our population growth and Crown liabilities. And everything that they do to control and manage us is all about controlling those things. So you chiefs have a serious choice to make here. Whoever you choose at this point as national chief, to me, this is a historical period similar to the 1969 White Paper era, when the federal government was proposing to terminate our rights then, and the constitutional talks of the 1980s, where we were arguing over the meaning of this new constitution. They want to use Section 91 and 24, Indians and lands reserved for Indians, to interpret Section 35, existing Aboriginal treaty rights, and the standards in the UN Declaration. They're doing all this without our involvement and consent. And you as chiefs, whoever you send to Ottawa, after this vote, the government is looking for the status quo. And if you vote for a status quo candidate, there's going to be repercussions. Because the Trudeau government's watching this election, they're wanting their status quo candidate. But many of our people are watching this election, and they want fundamental change. They don't want a status quo candidate. I'm the only one that can bring transformative change. The other candidates, from what I hear, all they're promoting is more the status quo, tinkering with the system, doing what Ottawa says, they're hijacking our right to self-determination. It should be us deciding that on the ground. And we can develop alternatives. You know, if I was national chief, I'd definitely be working with the chiefs that support me in developing those alternatives quickly, but also putting a brake to this legislative track. You know, we should be developing that because this is going to affect our peoples, and it should be our people having input into this from the ground up. We should put a stop to that. And if I'm elected as national chief, I'll put the brakes on that and say we're not supporting that We need to discuss the process that involves our communities, not this bogus national engagement process where you send the Crown Indigenous Minister around, shepherded by a senior assistant deputy minister, because she can't answer all the questions. And then they do letters of invite to chiefs, and only some show up and others don't. And they're asked to bring elders, women, and youth to represent that cohort. That's not consultation. They don't call it that. They call it a national engagement. But they're going to tick off the boxes. I think I already saw Minister Bennett said, oh, we had 90 engagement sessions. And they're going to use that to justify proceeding with this legislation, especially if you elect a status quo candidate. And they want to do this in September and October. So they don't want this election to interrupt their schedule. They're busy. They have plans for us. But where's our plan? They have a national plan they're implementing, and I haven't seen AFN develop a national plan except going along with their plan under the incumbent national chief. And if we want to have serious, sustainable economic development that respects Mother Earth and that, then we need to develop those plans. That's what I would promote and I would work on, is I get partners to come in to help us do that instead of these big corporations that want access to our lands and resources to exploit them. We need to have more sustainable development, green energy approaches. So our people are also watching this election too. Our people are watching this election, and there'll be consequences either way. If I'm elected, Ottawa's not going to like it, and there's likely to be repercussions because they're going to say you didn't elect one of our status quo candidates. We have plans, and this is going to mess up our plans, and they're going to be mad. But we're here. We're not going anywhere. They have treaty and fiduciary responsibilities to us, and they can't get out of that. And we can organize, and we can do our own national plan and make the changes we want, not what Ottawa's telling us to do. We can tell Michael Warnick to back off because he's behind this national plan too, the clerk of the Privy Council. Remember when he was Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs for 10 years? He got promoted by Trudeau in January 2016, temporarily. But he's behind all these moves we're seeing nationally. So we need to tell the bureaucracy too to back off, that we want to make our own plans. It's not for them to decide our path to self-determination. We need to do that. Each community has their own path, and they need to work at how they want that to fit into strengthening the sovereignty of the nation. That's what we need to do. So remember, our people, many of our people are watching this election. The choice you make, there'll be consequences. The government's watching. There'll be consequences on that side. But you have to choose. As a leader, at least 60% of you have to be involved in choosing. And whoever you choose, you better choose wisely, because either way you're going to have consequences. If you want the status quo, don't vote for me. If you want transformative change, then vote for me. Nyawa. Nyawa goa. I know.
Russell Diabo, do you wish the opportunity for closing comments? Please come forward, Mr. Diabo. Please help welcome our friend and colleague, Russell Diabo.
Michael, on this time?
Yes, it's on this time.
Somebody said boo. Well, you have voted, and as I told you, there'll be consequences for the way that you voted. And you can boo all you want. You can boo all you want. But with Minister Bennett coming here and directly interfering in this election, status quo moves. Did I hear moves? Moo. Anyway, you heard what I had to say yesterday. I'm not going to go through all that again, other than to say that I think this whole election is really tainted with the Crown Minister being involved in the election process, meeting with Chiefs caucuses, even before the voting process began. You can object to that all you want, but it reinforces what I've been saying about how this organization is basically controlled by the Trudeau government. And I'm saying to the people who are watching, it's really up to you now, because it's clear that this organization is not going to reform itself. It's going to have to happen from the outside. And I'm not going anywhere, so I'm going to be working to help reform the organization, and also still stopping the Trudeau legislation in a different role, but I still intend to fight to do that, because I still take the position that it's a termination plan that the Trudeau government's implementing, and our people's rights are in threat. And if this organization isn't going to do anything about it, then I'm going to work with our people who will. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diabo.